teachers will recognise this idea of a fear of failure from their classrooms. Many children are afraid even to put their hand up in class to contribute to discussions, even when they know the answer. They become anxious around performances and exams, and some are completely terrified of any form of public speaking.
Looking back, it's difficult to believe that it even happened. 10 years ago, I received an email from my head teacher asking who wants to be involved in designing and teaching a Year 7 learning skills curriculum. We would have the whole of Year 7, 5 lessons a week, to do with whatever we wanted. This was an unbelievable opportunity to do something really bold and different. I was keen to capture it in the most robust way possible. So I signed up to do a PhD, which turned out to be an 8-year study where we followed 4 cohorts of children from Year 7 through to Year 11, 1 control cohort and 3 learning skills cohorts. That evaluation found that those children went on to receive the best set of results that that school had ever seen by some margin. And it was especially beneficial for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the disadvantage gap closed from the bottom up, almost completely.
We wanted to design a curriculum that would enable our students to become more confident, proactive, and self-regulated with their learning. And we knew that a large part of that would be helping them to overcome this fear of failure so that they could face their fears, get past it, and get on with learning anyway. This book tells the story of a learning skills curriculum journey so far. But really, this is just the beginning of our story. And we hope that it will reach educators all over the world who will become involved with helping us to write the next chapter.
Fear is the mind killer.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for that, James and Kate. And we might just start. Where are you both in the world right now? Kate, you've got some darkness and some palmy looking things in the background. We'll maybe start with you.
You can start to see them. So I'm in the Dominican Republic right now. It's first thing in the morning. It's 6 a.m. here. So the sun is just coming up behind me. Yeah, I came here in January and I've been here ever since. And now I'm not sure that I'm going to leave. So that's where I am.
Good stuff. And you, James?
I am in a much more exotic setting. I'm in my lounge in Brighton in the UK.
Very good. And I'm in Melbourne in Australia at present. First question really is, how do you feel? How do you feel to have it done and all finished? It was a long time coming. How are you feeling about it, Kate?
It was a long time coming, wasn't it? I am in that kind of afterglowy bit a little bit. It's nice to have it out in the world. I feel kind of proud of myself, which is not something that I always recognize. And I'm really glad that we did it. I'm glad that we saw it through to the end. And I'm really glad that it's out in the world now. And I just hope that people enjoy it, I guess.
Wonderful. How about you, James?
Yeah, likewise. It's been such a long time in the pipeline. You know, this journey started 10 years ago. It was involved 8 years of research, about 3 years of writing up, and yeah, it just feels like we've been in labour for a really long time. And the hard copy arrived yesterday, so we've actually got our hands on the real thing, and it feels amazing. It really does, actually. It feels very nice. So, and but the most exciting thing is what people are going to make of it, you know. So it feels like we've finally got to this point, but you know, what happens next is what we're really excited about.
Awesome. I'll also mention for the people who've just joined, at the very end of this little book launch, there's gonna be a question that we'll ask you that's based on some hint that's offered in today's interview. So, and the first 10 people to write back in the Zoom chat with the correct response to that question will receive a free copy of Fear is the Mind Killer. So keep your ears peeled. All right. So first real substantive question here is, why is the book called Fear is the Mind Killer? And we might go to you here, James.
Yeah, because it sounds almost like a self-help book, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like a book about, you know, about helping kids to learn. As we were writing the book, we struggled to think of like what's the big unifying idea that sits behind all this work that we've been doing, because by its nature, the learning skills curriculum that the book is about is a complex intervention. So there's lots of little ideas that stack up and interact, and you get this bigger effect size overall. And so by its nature, it's not about one thing, it's about lots of different things. But then there was this phrase, one of the interviews that I did for my PhD was with our very good friend and colleague and former learning skills teacher, Paul Meredith. And I asked him a question about, has teaching learning to learn, has that changed the way in which you teach science? And he said, yes, massively. And he went on to talk about fear of failure, and how the children are often really terrified of making a mistake, and they'll sit before a blank sheet of graph paper for 20 minutes because they don't want to, as soon as they put pencil to paper, then they you know, there's the risk of making a mistake. And he says that he talks about that all the time, that they just need to get used to making mistakes and to get friendly with failure, if you like. And he used this phrase, fear is the mind killer, which is from the film Dune, as you may know, the science fiction book Dune. And there's this incredible thing called the Litany against fear, sort of like a little poem, which I won't read out, but it's on the inside cover of the book, which comes from that book. And so that phrase kept coming back. And so lots of the stuff that we were doing was about what's going on in your head, you know, helping kids to control their thinking a little bit more. But there's many layers to helping kids to get better at learning. And fundamentally, if you strip away all those layers, it's an emotional response. And there was this other phrase that somebody used recently when we work with teachers a lot, and there was a teacher who we were saying, what's the one thing you would change? And he used this phrase, the resident evil of fear of failure. He was saying that it's just absolutely endemic that kids, you know, they're terrified of putting their hands up to answer a question. It's the thing that teachers always say, parents even, didn't it? You should get more involved in class discussions, and kids don't. And if you ask them, why is it that you don't stick your hand up? Why is it that you don't get involved in discussions? They often say, it's just that there's a 1% part of me that thinks, like, I'm sure I know the answer to this, and I'm sure that I could make a valuable contribution, but there's just 1% of me, this doubting little voice that basically rules the roost, and that their hand goes up, they get a flood of adrenaline and they push it down. And you know, you see lots of kids with anxiety around exams. You see lots of kids who are terrified really of public speaking, as Kate mentioned in the film there. Some kids rip a whole page out of their books and start the whole thing again rather than just cross a single word out. So there's almost like this overcorrection that happens where kids are so terrified of getting anything slightly wrong that they just sort of, they keep themselves very small, and they keep their heads down, and they don't take risks. And so we realized that fundamentally, although there's many aspects to helping kids to get better at learning, you need to really address it at the level of this fear of failure that sits beneath all of that stuff.
Mm. Kate, did you want to add anything to that in terms of the title of the book?
Yeah, sure. So I guess once we'd identified that fear, even though it's invisible and not talked about very often unless you really dig, was a very large part of learning and successful learning, we started looking at what the antidotes to fear are. If it's there and exists, and it's something that a large number of students struggle with, how can we support them to get past it? And I guess that's what began to drive our curriculum. There were two layers to it. One was all of the cognitive stuff, all of the tools and strategies that were going to help them with their learning. And the other side was the emotional stuff, everything that goes around it, everything that was about the environment that they were in and how they were feeling. So we looked at safety from a practical external side to make sure that other classrooms were how they should be and that the safeguarding was in place. And we also taught them how to regulate themselves internally, because the adults in the room are taking responsibility for the external safety, but the children themselves need to take responsibility for their sense of internal safety. And once we could teach them how to find the calm within themselves, then wherever they went, whenever there was a challenge, they would be able to kind of dig deep and find the tools that they needed to manage their fear so that they could get past it. And that led to looking at confidence, all of the ways in which we could help them to build up their confidence little by little, every day, making the situations more and more complex, more and more challenging, so that they would feel confident again to meet new challenges as they came up. And they get that through experience. So all of these antidotes to fear are mentioned right at the back of the book. And the experiences we gave them were different to traditional methods of education in some senses, because they were always working together in groups, lots of other people coming in. They were having to step up and learn how to be in different situations. And that comes with knowledge. We had to teach them all of this stuff. So there's all of these antidotes to fear are at the back of the book. And that made it a very kind of, the whole thing is contained. It's a very holistic way of looking at learning. And it worked on us as well as teachers. We were quite fearful in the beginning of taking these risks with learning, but we used these tools on ourselves and we managed to hold our nerve, and it all came good in the end. And that's why there's a book.
That's great. And so many different moving parts there. It's amazing you managed to bring them all together. Could you maybe take us back a little bit to the start of this journey, Kate? And how did it start? How did you start getting involved? And how does a school decide to take on a challenge like this in the first place?
Well, it started with an observation, really, that children came up from year 6 with bundles of confidence and the ability to manage themselves. They'd been kind of the kings and queens of their castles in primary school. And then by Christmas time, they kind of become de-skilled, unable to just look for their own ruler in their own school bag or pack their own PE kit for the right day. And it appeared that there was something happening at the beginning of secondary school that was making them lose their confidence and making them lose their ability to make these independent decisions. And so we wanted to address that so that they weren't losing out on any valuable learning time, and they weren't losing out on that sense of safety and confidence that I already intuitively knew that they would need to do well as things got more challenging as they went up through the school. So the first iteration of the learning skills curriculum started around 2005, I think, and we looked at how we could bridge that transition between primary school and secondary school. And we designed a few models. We tried it and tested it over 3 years and learned a lot from that journey. And that's what I took with me when I moved into the new school, which is where I met James. And then he added all of his ideas into the mix. So it was a complex intervention for the students made out of a complex intervention of adults. So, and that's how it's grown. So it's kind of been a 15-year journey of observing and looking for answers and testing them out and making them better and figuring out which are the moving parts that we needed for our children in our context, so that we could support them to become the confident, independent, self-directed learners that we always felt they could be.
Thanks, Kate. Now, James, you mentioned it a little bit in the video at the start, but really, what was the impact of this big project?
Yes. So, as we said in that video, so we followed 4 cohorts of children from year 7 through to year 11, and we looked, there was 2 big sort of elements to it, really, the stats, if you like, and the stories. What was the impact that this program had on their learning across all the different curriculum subjects? And then also, what did the children say about this thing, and what did they write about it, and what did the teachers write about it as well, and what did the teachers say about it? And so, in terms of the stats, by the end of the first year, we could see that there was some things. It was a bit too soon to tell what the impact was on their academic learning. But for example, the attitude to learning scores. So as I'm sure you know, that in lots of schools, children get given an attitude to learning score by each of their teachers. Usually ours was on like a 6-point scale. And the attitude to learning scores of these children was way higher than previous cohorts. And so we started to see some bits of evidence in the data that it was having an impact. And then and that was partly why when that first cohort got to the end of year 7, the curriculum time expanded into year 8 with them, and then again into year 9, because the other teachers could see that this was really having an impact. So the first big analysis was when they got to the end of year 9, after 3 years of this, and that analysis found that these kids were performing way better than the previous year group, than the control year group, by quite a margin. And in particular, it was beneficial for disadvantaged kids. So like all kids benefited from it. Non-disadvantaged kids, if you like, did better than their counterparts in the control group, but it was especially beneficial. So the disadvantage gap closed, as I mentioned in the video, almost completely. So at the end, in that end of year 9 analysis, the disadvantage gap in the control group was about 25%. So the difference in attainment between children from disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers is about 25%, which is about average for the country. It's a little bit higher than average. And in the learning to learn cohort, that gap by the end of, after 3 years of learning skills, it was 2%. So we closed that gap from the bottom, like I said in the film, almost completely. And we saw almost exactly the same pattern of results 2 years later when they got to GCSE. They got the best set of results that that school had ever seen by some margin. And again, the gap closed hugely. I think the disadvantage gap closed by about 70% from one cohort to the next. So that was really strong. But it's a strong claim to be able to say, you know, obviously how kids do in their GCSEs is largely a function of how hard they worked, right? And how hard their teachers worked and so on. And for us to say, actually, we think that this is partly due to what we did in Key Stage 3 is quite a strong claim, and we don't make it lightly. So the bit where we can really sort of argue the case for some sort of causality here is that we looked at, so as part of the intervention, the children had learning journals, and they would write in learning journals once a fortnight for almost a whole lesson. And we often ask them about, you know, does learning to learn help you in other lessons? If so, how? So we would get evidence of transfer that way. And I also interviewed lots of kids, and we also interviewed teachers. And really consistently through that data, as we go through in detail in the book, we can pull out really consistent findings that the kids were doing better in their other subjects, and the kids were able to say how learning to learn was helping them get better in their other subjects, and the teachers were able to say that. And the one thing that it boils down to more than anything else was confidence. So one of the 3 big ideas in the learning skills curriculum is oracy, developing children's speaking and listening skills. And we really threw the kitchen sink at it. We had them doing lots of paired talks, small group work, structured debates, learning how to take part in philosophical inquiries, and how to stand at the front of a room and deliver a knockout speech. And when you support children to go through that process, it changes their perception of themselves. Like, it's not just about some mechanical, like, new skill that they've learned. It changes what they think about themselves, and they start to think, I could be that person who stands at the front of a room and makes things happen. And you can almost see them walking an inch taller. And in what they wrote in their learning journals and in the interviews, this word confidence just came up again and again, that they felt like they had found their voice, like physically found their voice, but also metaphorically found their voice. They developed a stronger sort of sense of identity. And that spills over into all kinds of things. It's not just in their academic learning, but in their peer relations. Some of them talked about how it changed the way that they interact with their families. So I think that we could argue a strong case that although this is only, you know, one study, and, you know, we're at the start of this journey really, and we're very keen to roll this out in other schools to see if we can replicate or improve these findings. But the early signs are that this actually made a difference, and we can point to particular mechanisms of how that difference happened.
That's great. And I love the way that you've broken it down there, and the way you do it in the book as well, with talking about the stats and then talking about the stories as well. I think that's a really powerful way to communicate it. Now, having these impacts in a school is one thing. It's very impressive, and it's one thing, but I'd imagine that you've written a book because you want to have a bigger impact. You want to spread the good word. So maybe we can go into that a little bit now, Kate. What is it that you hope to achieve through Fear is the Mind Killer?
I think what I'd like to do is is find the other educators who want to work in the same way that we do, and to bring all of those voices together. Because we had a particular recipe, if you like, or complex intervention that worked for us in our context, but every context is different. And so this book isn't a how-to guide that you can just read and apply in your context. It's something that you have to make for yourselves, and you really kind of have to invest in it, and it has to be exactly what you want it to be. So I would really like for this book to reach people who are interested in that process, but who maybe don't feel like they have the permission or the space or the time to get stuck in by themselves, so that we can kind of work together as a big group, because there's a lot of learning that we've gained over the last 10 years or so since we started, and we'd like to share that with more people, so that I guess more people can get to the place where we are, which is feeling really pleased that it was successful. Yeah.
And you're trying to do it all again in the Dominican Republic, Kate, as well.
Love it so much. I'm doing it all again. In fact, I haven't stopped since we did that at Seaview. I've taken the model out to refugee camps and open schools there. Yeah, it's my thing.
It is indeed. Did you want to add anything to that, James, in terms of what you hope the book will achieve?
Yeah, I mean, there's sometimes, you know, on really hopeful days, I can picture a future in which there's a curriculum like this in every school on the planet. Like, it seems ridiculous. One of the quotes that was in that film that we saw from a teacher called Martin Steiner, he said the question that he had from reading the book is, why isn't everyone doing this? And it just seems like a no-brainer. Like, we teach kids what to learn all the time, and it's important that we teach them the what of learning, you know, and we know all about subject knowledge and how important that is. But there's also a big how, and there's a balance to be struck here. And if we're not teaching them how to become more effective at learning, then we're just missing such a massive trick, because we're all about getting them qualifications, but qualifications, you know, they open doors for you, and that's true, but they don't teach you how to survive and thrive on the other side of those doors. And so I think that there's so many strong arguments for doing what we talk about in this book, that what I hope to achieve is that this just becomes, you know, a part and parcel of what happens in schools. And I'm not suggesting that everybody should get on it straight away and all start doing this tomorrow, but we would very much like to see a number of schools experimenting with these ideas and taking them forward. And I'd actually quite like to ask a question of you, Ollie, if I may, at this point, because the quote that you put, the endorsement quote, was that you said that this is the thing that you're the most excited about in education at the moment, which I thought was such a welcome and encouraging thing, because for those of you, in case you're not aware, Ollie is an incredibly knowledgeable guy. He runs a fantastic podcast, the Education Research Reading Room, in which he reads a book a month and interviews the author in forensic detail. And you have like this incredible encyclopedic knowledge and understanding of like what's happening, the big ideas in education at the moment. So I'm really interested to hear your take on this. Like, what is it that resonates with you about this, and why is it that you're so excited about it?
Yeah, there's thanks for asking, James. I guess there's lots of things I could say to that. One, there's a question I always start the podcast with, and that's what do you think should be the purpose of school-based education? I love both of your answers, and in addition to that, one answer that's particularly stuck with me is the answer from George Zonios, who I had back in episode 35. And I've subsequently gone on to work with George on a software called Dendro. But George's answer to that was, a question we always need to ask ourselves is, what happens when we stop pushing? So as teachers, you know, we can push and push and push and push, but there will become a time, and, you know, that's usually when students finish school. It might be over the holiday break, or recently we've been seeing this, you know, with online learning with COVID. We really find out what our students are like as learners when we stop pushing. And I think that that's, in many ways, as you said, James, you know, something we miss out in education is the how to learn. And I think it's something that we miss out so much. And, you know, we only look as far as the finish line, those degrees, those opening of those doors, and very rarely beyond it, or not frequently enough beyond it. So that's really the first thing. And then I mean, I've just done some writing about cognitive load, and from a cognitive load perspective, the way I put it is there is always an infinite source of extraneous cognitive load for students. That is, students can just choose to think about anything whilst they're in the classroom or doing anything. So ultimately, the person doing the learning is the student. And if the student isn't self-motivated to do that learning, if they don't feel empowered to do that learning, basically, no matter what the teacher does, the learning isn't going to happen unless the student chooses to cue in themselves. So the learning must start with the learner. And I think that the work that you two have done on this is crystal clear about how we can better support learners to head in the right direction on that journey and to be empowered to learn within and beyond school. So I guess that's my answer. I could probably talk more, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, no, thank you. It's really nice to hear.
I want to steal that one from you, Ollie. The learning begins with the learner. I like that.
Yeah, fair enough. No worries. Please feel free.
Said it in like a few words. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I guess that's kind of my reception of the book. But how have you felt about the reception of the book more widely? Because you have kind of thrown it into an educational ecosystem that, you know, where learning skills, some people are really behind it, but some people kind of aren't. And there's some pretty outspoken people on either side of the debate. How do you feel about how it's been received?
Yeah, absolutely. It does sort of go against the grain. I've seen some rumblings on Twitter of people sort of saying, oh man, you know, there's another book about generic skills, you know, we're going back to the Stone Age sort of thing. There are people who feel really strongly against this stuff. But so far, I mean, you know, we've only got the word of the reviewers that we sent it to, although we did send it, you know, we intentionally sent it to people from both sides of the aisle, if you like. And, you know, there was that quote, there was a quote by Mark Enser, a teacher and a test columnist who is, you know, quite traditional in his views. And he gave a quote where he said that, you know, he's usually pretty skeptical about this stuff, but he found this really eye-opening and refreshing. And you know, there's a few other people that we could point to from the traditionalist side. So one of the chapters in the book, the chapter 3, Learning to Learn on Trial, is where we look at these arguments against learning to learn, and then we sort of rebut them and say, you know, we can understand why people are against this stuff. And when you understand the history of learning to learn, you can see that, you know, you can see where it fell over, if you like. You can see where it sort of went a bit weird and people started backing away from it. But actually, you know, we're really hoping that this book will mount a big comeback, because there's such a lot in it, as we've already seen. So, you know, the early signs are really positive. But again, you know, this is just the beginning, and maybe those people were just being polite because, you know, we asked them to review the book. So let's see how it goes when it's out in the big wide world.
That's great. Did you want to add anything to that, Kate?
No, I'm good. I'm quite happy to stay under the radar. I will try and self-regulate through any negative feedback that I get, and carry on doing what I do. I mean, we've been working on this for a really long time, and while we were doing this, it was probably the least popular period in history for learning to learn, but we did it anyway because we believed in it, because we could see that it was working for us in our context with our students. So I guess, you know, like James has said earlier, it isn't for everybody. Not everybody needs to work in this way, but if you feel like working in this way could help you as a teacher and your students, then hopefully the book is there to help those educators move forward with the ideas. It doesn't have to be for everyone. That's okay.
That's great. And something else I really appreciate in the book is the way that you talked about the different generations of learning to learn. And you talked about how we're kind of within the 4th generation of learning to learn. A lot of the time when people are criticizing learning to learn, they're actually criticizing one of the earlier generations, but we've actually made many strides recently, and we've come a lot further. So I like that too. I did want to share, in terms of the reception, I did want to share one kind of quote, and this is from Dylan William, who's, you know, respected on both sides of the aisle, as you put it before, James. It's a bit of a long quote, but I did want to share it in full because I think it really captures what you've managed to do with the book. Here goes. As school systems around the world recognize that they are preparing their students for a world that no one can imagine, attention has, perhaps unsurprisingly, turned to whether it is possible to teach learners how to learn. And this has led to a rather polarized debate. On one side are those who argue that our traditional curriculum is unfit for the needs of today's learners, and that we should instead focus on so-called 21st century skills. At the other are those who provide mountains of evidence that such skills tend to be highly specific to particular subjects, and that learners rarely transfer what they have learned in one subject area to another. The truth is that both sides are right about some things. Some of what we need our students to learn are highly specific to a subject, but there are also ideas that go across the whole curriculum. The challenge is to discover what they are and how they can be effectively incorporated into the curriculum. And Dylan continues. This is why Fear is the Mind Killer by James Mannion and Kate McAllister is so welcome. The book tells the story of an implementation of a learning to learn curriculum in an English secondary school and how that approach increased student achievement, whilst at the same time closing the gap in achievement between students from more affluent and less affluent homes. More importantly, the story is told in sufficient detail that it provides a clear plan for how to implement such a curriculum elsewhere, with honest discussions of the challenges and difficulties encountered. I don't know of any other book that provides such clear guidance on how to harness the common elements of learning across a curriculum, bringing greater coherence to pupils' experiences in school, while at the same time respecting the real differences between school subjects. Highly recommended. You two must have been pretty stoked when that came through in the email account.
Yeah, really pleasantly surprised, because Dylan, was just saying to you about how you've got an encyclopedic knowledge of education. Like Dylan's got that, but also 30 plus more years of experience of doing this. So to hear him say that was really welcome, especially as he'd spent the previous weekend sort of sending me really long emails with really quite, he wasn't pulling his punches. He was, really quite rigorous in taking down some ideas in the book. And I thought he didn't like it. So then for him to come back with that was really, really surprising and very welcome. Yeah. That's
great. I did also want to mention there is a code that you can use at the moment to get the book 35% off. It's FEAR, FEAR 35. So if you write that down, that'll only work for the next 24 hours, I think. So that's a good option if you're keen there. Next question, who is the book for? We'll start with you, James. Who's it for? So that's a good question. We've thought about that a lot. I mean, our initial thought was that it's for teachers and school leaders. Obviously, it's about, school-based education. We think that it's relevant to everybody, who's got an interest in education, and that includes parents and carers as well. One of the reasons that it took so long to write, because I wrote my PhD and that was finished sort of 3 years ago, and I thought, I'll just turn my PhD into a book. It'll take 6 months, and it took 3 years because it's really hard to make this stuff readable, partly, and so. We hope that it will be appealing to people, right across the piece. And Kate was talking about, this is not only relevant to school-based, it might be what we're really interested in is, sorry, I just saw a question from Annette in the chat. We'll put a link to where you can get that code from. So I can't remember what I was saying. Yeah. You should be focusing on answering the questions, James, and let us handle the rest of that. No, it's okay. Now, the question that I asked was, who's the book for? Oh yeah. So we're very hopeful that it'll be applicable across the piece. We wanted it initially to be taken on board by similar schools to Seaview, where we developed this idea, which was a school in quite a disadvantaged area in the UK. But like you see, even before COVID, it's really hard to implement change within the state sector. So although that's where we would really like to see this have a big impact, it might be that it's other places. Kate's gotten so good at self-regulation. She's self-regulated her way to the Caribbean, and she just bought a school there, and that's going to be the next chapter for her. And like she said, we're taking this into workplaces, into universities, into refugee camps, and the alternative sector is thriving, and more people are getting interested in homeschooling, especially with COVID. And so we think that it's got wide appeal. We hope certainly that it's got wide appeal. Great. Did you want to add anything to that, Kate?
No, I guess I just wanted to add that anyone who's interested in learning, I think that lots of us grow up with this idea that learning happens in school, and if you don't do well at it in school, you've wasted your ticket. And learning is something that happens for the whole of the time that you're alive, as far as I'm concerned. And I would think, I think that most of the things that I learned since I didn't do very well at school and wasted my ticket. And so I guess the book applies to everybody who's interested in learning, because they can read it and look at it from the perspective of themselves. They can read it and look at it from the perspective of the people around them that they're trying to support with their learning. So if you're interested in learning, then I think it's an interesting book, I hope, at least.
Wonderful. Now we might go to questions from the audience here. Feel free to type them in the chat. We've got one from Annette, which we'll come to. But whilst people are typing questions in the chat, we had one pre-sent in from Andrew Threadgould, and that is, what do you see as one thing teachers/schools should be doing for pupils with respect to learning to learn, and particularly in light of this disruption to learning arising from COVID?
Yeah, thank you for that, Andy. So what's the one thing that schools could do? I thought about this a bit, and it's a hard question to answer, because there isn't, any question that says like, what's the one thing? Every context and every situation is different. But if you forced my hand and I had to pick a strategy, I would go for a weekly review, which is basically, it's a very simple idea. It's just like a weekly check-in. And the reason that I chose that is because it's applicable. If you're a tutor, you can do it with a tutor and ask your kids, how's your week gone the previous week? If you're a subject teacher, you can, use it to focus in on how things are going in maths or in drama or whatever, or as a parent or carer. And you can ask, lots of different questions in a weekly review, but it's essentially a sort of Janus-faced thing where you're just looking backwards and looking forwards. So one of the big ideas in this book is that learning how to learn, it really involves two processes: monitoring and control. So you start by paying attention, noticing, observing what's going on for you, what are you finding difficult, what are you finding, really easy, what's surprising you. And then when you do that monitoring work, you start to sort of learn where the levers are, and then you start to control your learning more. And so monitoring questions, you could just ask questions like things like, how did the last week go for you? What were the highs and lows of the last week? What would you do differently if you could live the last week again? What would you do more of? What could you do less of? That sort of thing. And so you get them to just do that stuff where they're just paying attention to how things are going. And then you turn to the forward-looking stuff, and where you ask more control-type questions, things like, what's coming up in the next week? What could you do now to make sure that the next week goes well? What new things could you try? What would amazing look like, a week from now? What would it look like? What would it feel like if you absolutely nailed this week, and so on? And you just rinse and repeat that process every week. And so it's a powerful thing, and it's something that's applicable, like I say, in lots of different contexts. And you can use it on yourself as well, like a sort of journaling method, weekly journaling. So that would be my answer.
Wonderful. Thanks, James. That kind of, I hope that in some ways addresses Freya's question in terms of what are some of the core strategies. We've got quite a few questions come through. We'll probably finish at the hour mark, so I might just jump to choose one here. One from Mark Quinn is, why have previous learning to learn seal and opening minds apparently failed to take hold? Is learning to learn inherently difficult to implement? I think, did one of you want to address that one?
Can I go?
Yeah.
So having lived through and used all of those, I think I would say they're not straightforward to implement. It's a messy process. It's a human process. You kind of have to put all of yourself into the process. But the key difference, I would say, with learning to learn is that it's learner focused. So the others, somebody else, they were designed in order to empower the students, but I think that they were applied from the regulation came from outside. So the situations were created artificially in order to develop team working skills or determination skills or whatever they were. And it was the artificiality of those situations that didn't really help the students to figure out for themselves what they needed to do in order to be a good team player, and what determination felt like when it was coming from inside them. And so I think that that's what's different about learning to learn, is that it's a deeply personal process, and every student is going through it in a slightly different way. And they design these situations, and they're not artificial. They're there for a purpose. It's something that they've chosen to achieve, and therefore they have to figure out how they're going to achieve it. So they're kind of going from this greater purpose, and then backwards into what's the knowledge and skills that I need in order to achieve my purpose, and then what tasks do I need to conduct and carry out in order to gain the skills and knowledge I need in order to achieve my higher purpose. So it's coming from within them. And what do I need to do when I get stuck? Who can I ask? What can I do? And so all of those labels that the other ones kind of put over the top of those behaviors are coming from inside them, and the language comes from inside them. And that's how I feel it's slightly different. I've used all of them, and they all have lots of really good things about them, but something didn't. The reason we picked them all apart and put them back together as something different is because they all had good stuff in, but something wasn't quite working for our students in our context. There was something just not personal enough about them. I guess that's just maybe what happens when you try and systemize something that's supposed to help human beings, because they're all so different.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate.
Can I just add to that? That's a really good answer. I think I would just add as well, because part of the question was like, why did previous efforts fail to take hold? Is it inherently difficult to implement? I think the part of it that you alluded to earlier, Ollie, was that like stuff that happened in earlier generations of learning to learn. You know, there were some ideas that were very intuitively appealing. Things like, you know, brain gym, the idea that you can exercise your brain like it's a muscle, and you can sort of get better at doing stuff by doing mental exercises. It's sort of an appealing idea. And you could also argue maybe that there's a bit of growth mindset in there, that, you know, the idea that learning takes effort. And things like learning styles, this idea that children have different learning styles, or multiple intelligences, you know, that you can be musically intelligent or spatially intelligent or visually and so on. All of those ideas were sort of appealing. And it turns out that we, you know, after having experimented with them, it turned out that there wasn't really any evidence that teaching with multiple intelligences in mind, for example, was any more effective than not doing that. And so we were experimenting with these ideas, and the teaching profession has been on a journey. And it seems that people have got two different ways of responding to that. Some people look back and they sort of talk about feeling angry. They think that they've been sort of led up the garden path by pseudo-scientific sort of snake oil salesmen who were sort of just spinning all of this nonsense to make money and to, you know, to pull the wool over teachers' eyes. But there's another, you know, Guy Claxton has another sort of more forgiving analysis where he talks about this is almost like there's like an adolescent phase of development that we were going through, that we were sort of trying these ideas, a bit like an adolescent haircut that you know seemed like a good idea at the time. You probably wouldn't revisit it again, especially, well, not when it's not an option anymore. And so I think that, you know, we've been trying for a long time to sort of to make it's a complicated business, teaching kids how to get better at learning. When you think about how many different kinds of schools there are, how many different kinds of kids and personality types, and how many different types of teachers there are, it's a complicated business. This is not a problem that we're going to solve overnight. But, you know, we've made lots of really strong progress over the last 40 years or so. And we think that with this book, we've really pushed that field further forward into a way that's practical and hopefully easy to implement and to replicate. And not just to replicate, but I strongly think that we can seriously improve on the findings that we published in this book, partly because we've got so much more clarity now than we had 10 years ago, especially about implementation. So thank you for the question, Mark. It's a good one.
Marvelous. Now, I imagine you've both been having a bit of a read of the questions. Have you? If you have, and if there's one that stands out for you, feel free to, I know James's eyes have been on them. Feel free to pick one to answer. And if not, I can pick one for you.
Okay. There was the one from Lynn about, are you putting together a year 7, 8, 9 friendly version for students so that they can access this directly as well as through their teachers? That's a really good question. There is a really good book that was published recently by Barbara Oakley and Alistair McConville called Learning How to Learn. And that uniquely, in this field is aimed at kids. But this is something that we're really interested to work on. So yeah, there's not any concrete plans for that, but I'm very interested in working this in the future. And I know that Ollie is interested in doing this as well. So maybe a future collaboration.
Were there any other questions that you were keen to address?
I kind of like to address the question from Sue Hellman, because I think one of the challenges that comes back from people is, yeah, but you had this unbelievable opportunity to do what you did. You had a head teacher who supported you and who believed in it, who gave you time and space. And time and space are incredibly precious commodities in a school, especially when maths and English results are all powerful. And so I think, so we faced those challenges too. The head teacher was definitely behind us, but there were other members of senior leadership team who didn't believe in it quite so strongly as he did. And so I think the mistakes that we made in the beginning were not being brave enough with our vision and telling everybody early enough what we wanted to achieve. I wanted to quietly work on it in the background and make sure that it was effective before it grew. And that threatened its very existence because we weren't making a big noise about what we were doing. And so I guess what we would do differently now, and what we plan to do differently with other schools, is to support teachers in collecting their evidence right from the get-go, teaching them how to, or working with them to kind of develop a sort of a robust way of implementing this, sort of gently but firmly, to make sure that it takes hold as quickly and as strongly as it possibly can from the beginning, because it isn't popular with everybody, and therefore it will come under criticism. So you need the strength of your team together, holding you together when the criticism comes, because it comes, right? Because when you hand over the responsibility from the teacher to the children, like, it doesn't always go smoothly the first time, right? Anyone who works with children can understand that when you give them some responsibility for making decisions about how they learn and what they learn, mistakes get made. So those challenges were real, but I think if you start small and you collect the evidence and you can speak with passion and have it on paper as well to prove that what you're doing is having an impact, then it will make it easier to ask for that time and that space that you need in order to make it grow.
Thanks, Kate. James, did you want to address any other questions? And if you do, maybe if you could read the question out prior to responding, just so the people who can't see the Zoom chat, maybe watching it later or on the live stream, can know what you're responding to.
Yeah, sure. There's one from Nazam Hussein. It says, I'm an educational psychologist, and this is very relevant. What are your thoughts on how to scale this up, replicate the program across contexts? And if it's not a step-by-step program, what frameworks do you use to maintain implementation fidelity, if you like? So I've become quite obsessed in recent years with this emerging field of implementation science. This sort of group, it started in sort of psychologists have been working on this, and it's much more developed in the world of healthcare than it is in education. But it's taking this question of, like, what can we take about what we know about what works or what doesn't work, and then translate that into policies and practices that are able to replicate or improve on those effects when we, implement them in diverse real-world contexts. And we've made some massive leaps and bounds towards coming up with a whole framework. So one of the things that I've done, is the focus of my next book, is to put together a toolkit of ideas that teachers and school leaders can use to implement not just learning skills, but anything effectively. And I've been running workshops on this for the last few years, and the feedback has been absolutely phenomenal. Like, there's a massive hunger out there for people for this knowledge. So that this is something that we've thought about a lot. And one thing that we really don't want to happen, and we've been so emphatic in this throughout the book, we don't want somebody to take this book and then go, right, you know, we're going to implement this in a top-down way. And, you know, they're in the middle of the book, in chapter 5, it's the longest chapter in the book by far. There's all these practical ideas for things that you could do. But if somebody tried to implement those in a top-down way, like, A, it wouldn't work, and B, you'd drive yourself and everybody else mad. Like, so in the end of the book, there's a chapter called an implementation checklist, where we're so, and that thing that you talked about in the question, Nazam, about implementation fidelity, like you want people to, there's this idea that Dylan Williams talks about called tight but loose implementation. Like you don't want it to be so rigid that it doesn't adapt itself to new contexts, and equally you don't want it to be so loose that it just undergoes a series of lethal mutations and becomes something that's completely different. And so we've tried to apply the principles of implementation science. So we've got a checklist of 6 sort of what we consider to be the non-negotiables, and also how we can be flexible with those non-negotiables, if you like, so that we can adapt them to each context. So that's something that we've thought about very carefully indeed. And hopefully, we'll see in the years to come whether we're onto something.
Cool. We've probably got time for you to respond to one more question if you'd like to.
Kate, do you want to take this one? So there's one from Kate Farraher. What top 2 things does the teacher need to learn to deliver like this or for their children? Is it a coaching, facilitating approach or something different?
Ooh, top 2 things. That's tricky. I think one of the key things that I wish I had known more about before we started, when we started talking about self-regulated learning, we were very much focusing on the cognitive aspect, and we were less explicit about what self-regulation was and how it's a physical thing. It's a mind and body thing too. So I think it really helps if teachers can self-regulate so that they can then co-regulate with their students. It's a modeling thing. When teachers know how to manage their own fears, their own stresses, their own challenges in a range of ways, then it's easier for them to feel confident about supporting their students to develop a range of ways to cope with stresses and challenges that come up in school and in daily life. So I think learning about self-regulation and what it is and how to do it, it's a practice, right? It's not, you can't take a workshop on self-regulation and like I can teach that now. It's a lifetime practice of every time you go into a new situation and you notice how you respond, thinking, okay, could I have done that differently? What could I have done differently? So having a compassionately curious approach to everything that you do in your job, I think is one of the top things that you can do. And so that is a coaching and a facilitating thing. I think you have to start with a workshop, you have to start with some reading, and then you have to continue your own personal journey as a person and as a practitioner with using all of these tools and strategies yourself, so that you can speak from a place of honesty with your students. You can say, I know how hard it is to change your habits because I am trying to change mine, but we're going to do this together. We're going to figure it out together. We're going to get to a point where I can trust you to take responsibility for your own learning, and you can trust me to support you on that journey. So wherever you are today is the best place to start. Some people are already good at self-regulating. They grew up in a household where it happens, and they've developed positive models for managing stresses and challenges, and other people don't have those. So as soon as you start to just notice what you do when challenges come up, you can start to think about how you might do them differently. And as a team, you work together on that. You balance one another out, and you support one another, and you learn from each other. And so I think that would be my top 2 things, is learning about self-regulation and supporting one another with co-regulation.
Become a better human to become a better teacher. That's great, Kate. That's wonderful. All right, let's not forget, for those who are on Zoom, there is an opportunity to now win yourself a copy of Fear is the Mind Killer. I would recommend that you type into the chat your email right now, so that when you pose the question, you just have to add the answer to the question underneath your email. So I'll just give you a second to write your email in there. Okay, now the question that you need to answer is, you just have to answer it, then hit enter as fast as you can. We can only have 5. Fear is the mind killer. Here's the question. Fear is the mind. Sorry, 10. I said 5 times 2. Here's the question. Fear is the mind killer takes its name from which science fiction film and a book?
Oh my goodness, Kate got in there before you'd even
Nice
finished
work,
the
Kate.
question.
Nice work. All right, they're coming in. I think Kate knew what the answer was. Great job, everyone. Well, thanks you. We'll let those entries keep coming in, and we'll officially close the launch. Thanks for your time today, James. Thanks for your time, Kate, and thanks to everyone who came along. I really enjoyed hearing from you two, and I think the wisdom of these two really shone through. I can't recommend the book highly enough. If you'd like to get yourself a copy, don't forget that code FEAR, FEAR 35 for 35% off for today only. And to find the book, you can just Google John Catt, Fear is the Mind Killer, and it should come up, or James Mannion, Kate McAllister, Fear is the Mind Killer. Thanks for your time today, and we'll see you in future.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Take care. We'll see you soon.
And thank you, Ollie, for always being here to help us with stuff. You're a superstar, because I know it's late where you are. So thank you very much to everybody for being here on a Sunday.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, thank you very much. And these rain stopped. Sun's coming out. There's a bright future ahead of us. Thanks, everyone.
Daytime here.
Cheers.
Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.